Hello, for today's video I'm going to present my own viewpoints on natural law theory. Natural law theory, in the way I'm defining it, refers to the natural law theory in St. Thomas Aquinas and the Scholastics as it was derived from prior thinkers such as Aristotle, with influences from Neoplatonic thought and earlier church fathers like Augustine. Now, without going too deep into the historical roots, metaethics, as it pertains to a discipline, as it relates to natural law theory, is a discussion on ethics as it concerns what we mean by definitions used and utilized by ethical thinkers. What does good mean? What does bad mean? What does evil mean? These are things considered under metaethics. Other considerations are they statements that are true in light of purely Platonic and axiological bases, or are they naturalistic? Are they emotive and incomprehensible as propositions? Or are they all just purely fictitious? These are questions the metaethicist concerns him or herself with. Under natural law theory, moral realism is true. Moral statements can be true or false. It is right to harm another human being. It is wrong to harm another human being. Are propositions we could bring up that could be either true or false. Furthermore, they are based in something found within the natural realm. That is, natural functions, ends, and tendencies. Let us begin. What does it mean to say it is wrong to take away somebody's freedom of speech? Let's start with the phrase wrong. What does wrongness entail? Wrongness entails a prescriptive attitude, things we ought not do, things that are contrary to our rational ends and goals. So the thing that this proposition is directing us to is other human beings. And the people who are trying to understand it are intellectual beings, beings who can grasp the content of the proposition itself. Human beings are such creatures. Ghosts and angels and God, if they are to exist, are also capable of grasping these propositions. Now, where do we commence from here? What is it that makes something right or wrong? The first thing we need is a robust and realistic idea of human nature. Human nature is not merely descriptive. It is not an analytical truth, but rather is a synthetic truth. To use Aristotle's modes of causality, there is the formal cause, what something is. There is the final cause, which is the ends or tendencies, the telos, or the purpose of the formal cause. There is the material cause, what the form itself is composed of. And there is the efficient cause. I, as a human being, have my efficient cause within my parents, and quite a few other physical forces within the universe. My material cause is matter. And of course, the mode the matter takes. Of course, this is a multicellular structure. So I'm a multicelled eukaryote being. There is the formal cause. Man is a social and rational animal. And lastly, there is the final cause. What our main purposes or ends are. The main purpose of our functions, that is. So the intellectual faculty has its end in being intellectual, grasping at true propositions about the world itself. That is the final cause of that. Our social functions is to breed and cultivate more human beings and raise them where they can fully instantiate their natures, if you will. The nature is also the formal cause. And that is what these particular ends have their basis on. To cite the intellectual faculty, for example, the intellectual faculty is the main drive. We exist to grasp truths and about reality itself. For us to contradict that would be to go against our intellectual faculty, even willfully or ignorantly. And of course, that is our main drive. If we were to deny this, well, then there becomes a normative problem here. Truth can essentially be subjective. But if that was to happen, then pretty much anything could be taken along those ends, and that constitutes a reductio ad absurdum. Now, with regards to social ends, those are taken to be good for the purposes and ends of cultivating the intellectual faculties. If we were to drop children off in the woods, they would not be able to develop any of these things. They would be like feral children. I'll send a link in the description about feral children for those of you who are interested in that. These are children who are raised by animals and are incapable of developing linguistic and high-order intellectual faculties. So as human beings, these are our main two ends here. And we also have ends in other faculties. The heart exists to pump blood. This would mean that the heart is good based on that end, or working improperly, or bad based on that end. Now, a good human being is a human being that is living in accord with his natural end, or her natural ends. A bad human being is not. Being good or bad isn't related to the action, per se, but rather to the human being. A good heart is one that pumps blood much better than a faulty heart. A good use of reason is one that apprehends truth, and a bad one is one that contravenes it. So, with that in mind, we work to natural ends. And of course, the difference between human beings who understand this, why it implies a moral ought, or moral impairment, is that, well, not moral impairment, moral in... crap, it's skipping my mind, it's live. The reason why it's pushing us for moral action is this. We as humans and rational beings can commit ourselves to action and understand the consequences of our action being negative to our social and intellectual ends, or be it positive. We have no choice but to be rational. This is why logical contradictions kind of hurt us, make us feel uncomfortable, things of that nature. So ultimately, human reason is what grounds rights, and human nature as a whole also. Freedom of speech, for example. Why are other human beings objectively entitled to recognize this? Well, two things. As social creatures, knowing true facts about the world is what pushes us for better social mobility. We know true things, of course. This means we can provide true and helpful bits of information to our fellow human beings. Likewise, for us to recognize falsehood, we also have to know of people speaking falsehoods. And with regards to this, we would have a right to know falsehoods and truthhoods. And we even have a right to teach people who hold bad ideas about things. So already we can start building justifications and justifiable arguments based on the ends and tendencies within human nature. And we have to commit ourselves to these if they are truly good arguments. Otherwise, we would be contradicting our own ends and committing ourselves to being bad persons. So normativity is something that is indeed found in nature. To consider ends as purely social constructs or analytical descriptors is what constitutes as a firm defeater for the natural rights advocate, at least under the classical Thomistic school of thought. Now, of course, if there is something that is intrinsically good or bad to human nature, then this also means that God can understand human nature itself. And of course, because God is a perfectly rational being, he would work in accord with human nature. For him to work contrary to human nature would, of course, mean that there is something morally unjustified with what God is doing. But because of God's omnibenevolent standard and omniscient standard that the theist is committed to, God ought to know what is good for human beings, and if he isn't going to be irrational, ought to commit to them as well. Because God is essentially rational, he will. Just like human beings who ought to be rational, even though we fail at this at times, ought to be as well, and we ought to commit to rational ends. So this is how we can go from the meta-ethical to the application of this into a legal imperative of recognizing a right through civic policies and ends. And of course, this is the ultimate justifier for governments. If governments are justified in the sense of cultivating human ends and tendencies, then that is their justification for existing. And if they contravene that, well, then they ought not exist. This leaves the natural rights theorists perfectly open and susceptible for a kind of anarchism. Anarcho-capitalism, socialism, either of these might be in accord, but the natural rights theorists would have to show that particular governments, or even governments simpliciter, are all contrary to it. You can, on the other hand, you could be a natural rights theorist and believe in a total despotism, so far as it obliges the natural ends and functions of human beings. I would argue it does not. You could also take a small government position, such as I do. Now, with that in mind, I close this video and hope this was found to be informative. The purpose isn't to convince anyone of natural rights theory, but merely to describe it. Whether or not you ultimately buy into it is contingent upon your willingness to buy into a realistic mode of human nature and a realistic mode of buying into final causality. So it's to recognize both metaphysical realism as well with regards to human essences, ends, and functions, as well as a normative application of them. I thank you all for your time.